I am Penelope, author of epic fantasy and paranormal romance, and welcome to my imaginary friends, a look behind the scenes of an author mapping the worlds in my head and making them a reality. Hello friends, today is Saturday, February 1st, 2020, and this is episode 53 of My Imaginary Friends. I'm Leslie. So this week's best thing, I'm going to go with a tie. I did get a new tattoo this week, which I'm super excited about. I got it from the same artist, Burnham in Baltimore, that I got my last one, the fairy. So underneath the fairy tattoo that I have is a castle coming out of an open book. And it's both, it's healing now, so it still looks really flaky and gross. It's in that stage where you're like, did I make a terrible mistake? Because this thing looks like I have a disease. But in about a week, it'll look good. So I'll see if I can get a picture for the podcast. But the castle coming out of the book was an idea because, of course, it's like a very fantasy image. But my name, Leslie, one of the meanings of it is gray castle or gray fortress, and I've always thought that was kind of cool. So I combined those two ideas, just like being a fantasy writer, loving fantasy, with my fairy, and what would be a cool addition to that. So that did that on Sunday. The other best thing this week was the series finale of The Good Place. And this is a show I started watching way after it started. I think my brother got me into it. And I binged it. I binged the first 2 seasons, and then by that time, the 3rd season was out. And so I watched the series finale live. That was the only episode I've ever watched as it aired on TV. And I didn't live tweet it or anything. I was just focused. And it was so wonderful. It's another one of those shows that from beginning to end, 4 seasons, they hit it out of the park. I mean, it's great. All seasons are great. And it changes. Every season is completely different from the last one. And it made me wonder did they have a plan? And I haven't done any research about this, but I do wonder, did they go into it thinking that this was going to happen and they only wanted 4 seasons? Because it's another one of those shows where it ended at the right time. You know, you're not stretching it out for 12 and 15 years. I don't know how they would stretch that idea out anymore. Because each year I was a little concerned about like, how is this going to work? And they flipped it. They rebooted it sort of, but it made perfect sense. And it's also one of those shows with all kinds of Easter eggs. Like a character who appeared once in season 2 is in the finale, and, you know, just the terms that they created, you know, you see everyone talking about holy forking shirt balls and just like all the terms and the lingo. And it was just a great show. And it was both life affirming and kind of thoughtful, but just sweet and heartfelt. And all the characters were wonderful. So if you haven't watched The Good Place, and I recommend it, go binge it, watch all 4 seasons. It's wonderful. Writing update. Things are still going well with book 4, Requiem of Silence, in the Earthsinger Chronicles, and I'm moving through it. I had a couple of days this week where I was a little stuck, and what happened was I'm doing the revision, so 1 POV at a time, and there are 5 main POVs. So I got to a good stopping point for one. Like I wanted to get to the midpoint. I got right before the midpoint, and so I was going to switch to the next POV that was on my schedule for this week. And the first few scenes were fine. I'm just revising. I know that I'm going to have to write some new stuff, but I saw the scenes and I thought that I had a fast draft for everything that was in there. So one day I got to a scene, and it has a label on it in Scrivener, and I open it up and it's blank. I have written nothing. And I'm like, oh crap. I thought I was just revising today. I was not ready to write a new scene today, especially since there was no notes in it. So usually in my Scrivener file, I'll have in the little index card, there's a description for the scene. I just had the title and I couldn't remember why that scene was there and what was supposed to happen in it. So that started me going back to my notes. I have a couple of text files. Okay, first of all, I have the outline for each POV character inside of Scrivener. So I went back and read that, and then I was like, oh no, this was a scene that I added, and I stuck it in there, and where were my notes about it? So that led to a search of various text files and index cards until I finally found it on an index card. But these many months later, from when I decided to put that scene in, I still don't remember why. Like I saw the index card and what I thought about it, but it didn't resonate anymore. So then I had to come up with a whole new scene, which required going back to the character worksheet that I did, So I have this, onestopforwriters.com has these great, a lot of great tools, just a ton. And one of them is a character profile. So I had created for a bunch of the characters, I think 4 out of the 5 POV characters, I did really detailed character sheets for them after the fast draft or at some point in the process. So I went back to that, to this character's goals and motivation, and then I went and I did some of the other worksheets on that site, which are the scene builder, and like I talked about last week, the character arc progression, until I could figure out, where in the arc we are, what has to happen here, what should be the emotional focus of the scene, and then that helps me figure out the actual actions of the scene, because I know where it has to get to, but this is, a middle of the storyline scene that it has to do work. It has to do a lot of work. But at this point, I don't want to overwrite. I mean, I'm not an overwriter. I write very lean and I usually have to add. So I want to make sure that I'm adding the thing I need because of time and just efficiency. So that took up my writing time for at least a day. And then I finally got to the point where I could outline the scene. I charted out using my system and using StoryGrid. And then I'm ready to fast draft it. And then I just didn't want to. So now I'm thinking that either I'm just procrastinating because I spent 2 days not writing and going through, but researching and doing all this background stuff. So it's either procrastination or it's something wrong with what I chose. And at this point, I feel like I just need to push myself and write it. There's some resistance. And so often resistance is, I think for me, resistance is one of those two things. It's just that I'm being lazy and I need to push myself, or I need to take a step back and look at this again and make sure it's something that is the right thing to write, because it could be pushing back. I could be pushing back on it because subconsciously I know that it's not quite right. And I haven't figured out which that is. And usually it requires actually just pushing myself through to write it. And then I can figure out if I was being lazy or if something's actually wrong with the thing that I've written. I would love to be able to figure that out earlier. But that's just not how things work for me. Which makes me think of Jeffe Kennedy. Now, if you listened for a long time, you know that I listened to her podcast, First Cup of Coffee. And I love listening to her process. I mean, it's so vastly different. She has a book due in April that she hasn't started. I mean, I guess she's starting it in February. Jeffe, that stresses me the hell out. Whenever I hear you talk about that, I break out in hives almost. I'm like, oh my gosh, what about just contingencies? And I know that she has been doing this for a long time. She has dozens of books under her belt, and so I'm sure her process is together. But maybe I could write a short story in 2 months and feel confident that I had, given enough time for all of the craziness that happens in my head. But a full-length fantasy novel in 2 months, I mean, okay, she writes full time, and that's why comparisonitis is bad, because everyone's in different situations, everyone's mind works differently, their time works differently. But honestly, even if I was writing full time, I couldn't do a full length fantasy novel in 2 months. So more power to you, Jeffe. I still listen, even though it makes me itch when you talk about writing a book and turning it in 2 months. But yes, that's why we're all different. And her books are wonderful, so it works for her, but never for me. You see what happens. I spend 2 whole days just trying to write one scene, and it'll actually be probably 3 or 4 days by the time I fast draft the scene and then revise the scene at least twice, and probably 2 more times after that down the road. Yeah, that doesn't work for me. And also I was reminded of something else I saw, and I think Robin Lefevre's originally, I saw her talk about this originally, how plotting is like playing a game of 3D chess, because as I'm looking at everything holistically, I'm working on one POV, but I'm thinking about the whole book, and I'm thinking about the whole series and making sure that everything is lining up. And it really does feel like 3D chess in my brain, making all these pieces fit. I think when I'm in a POV, I'm dialed into that character's story, then I know what I'm doing. I think the switching to someone new, okay, now I have to come back out, go into her head, remember all of her issues and what she's dealing with emotionally and her outer conflict and her inner conflict and where she needs to end up. And all the forces arrayed against her, all that stuff, all the writing, characters, story stuff. But yeah, it's fun. Like, revision is my favorite thing to do, even when it's not completely straightforward. Also, something inspired by something that Jeffe said about pre-orders for her books, and she does pre-orders on her website for her books. And I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. I've been stressing about the pre-order for the second novella, which is Hush of Storm and Sorrow. I did pick a release date. It's coming out March 16th. And I also set up a pre-order on my own website, not anyone else's. So at the very least, if I don't get to the other pre-orders, I will have this one up. I used payhip.com, which is something that Joanna Penn talks about and uses. There's a variety of ways to do it. And since I'm a web developer, I could have set up my own online store using like WooCommerce and integrated that. And that's something I might do down the road if this is successful, if I feel like it's worth it. But it was relatively little time to set up PayHip and BookFunnel to deliver the books. So, and then they have this cool little integration where you don't actually have to leave my website. Because one of the things I don't like is when you click a button and you go somewhere else to buy something, it just feels less professional and less, integrated. So any of my self-published novellas, which are Angelborn, Angel Fall, Breath of Dust and Dawn, and coming up Hush of Storm and Sorrow, are available on my website. There's a button on each book page for buy the ebook direct from the author. And these are all just ebooks now. I will bundle them as print books when the series are done, which for Angelborn might be never, but we're not going to say that. We're going to be positive. But yeah. And if you're interested in one of the novellas, I have a coupon going. So they're all $2.99, but if you use the coupon code FRIENDS, you can get them for 99 cents. And that'll all be in the show notes. So I'm excited about that. I thought it was really fun setting it up because I love setting up web stuff. I mean, that's why it's my job. But because it was, it required creating a store on PayHip and then doing, setting up BookFunnel to that, because BookFunnel.com is a service that sends the ebook to you so that you don't have to sideload it. It's how you get it onto your Kindle or e-reader or however you read ebooks. And I already had BookFunnel because I use it for my newsletter to deliver the freebies that I send out. So I send out two free short stories to people who sign up to my newsletter, and they come over the course of a few weeks. And I like BookFunnel, and I will be using it to send out the arcs of Hush when I get to that stage. If you are interested in getting an arc of Hush of Storm and Sorrow, just email me, hello@lpenelope.com. I'll be reaching out to people who are already on my arc list, and if there are new people, let me know. Because I will be sending that out probably once I get through the copy edits, which is going to be next week, I'll probably start organizing ARC readers for the novella. Also, I've been watching Sanditon on PBS. So Sanditon is Jane Austen's unfinished novel. Now, there was another version of Sanditon, which I watched a little bit of. It was an online, like a YouTube web series version by the people who did the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which I adored. Lizzie Bennet Diaries was a version of Pride and Prejudice that was done as a web series, and Lizzie Bennet had like her own web show. And I'm not going to go into a huge tangent about that, but I loved it. I'll link to that if you were interested. So they had done a Welcome to Sanditon web series, which is my only real knowledge of Sanditon. I thought that one was kind of boring because it wasn't so much a story. It was more like an experience or something. But I am interested to go back and look at how they did that adaptation and then how the BBC adaptation is. So I was really enjoying it at first, but the last couple of episodes have been short and I haven't really been feeling them. And part of it is the quote unquote hero, Sydney, I can't remember his last name now, but played by from Divergent, who is Theo James, who is someone I really enjoy watching. And I thought that I would really like him as the hero, but his character is such an asshole. And then you've got this other guy, young Stringer, who is like a really great person. And he obviously likes our heroine, Charlotte. And so I'm really pulling for Stringer. And I know that they're being pushed towards Sydney because he's the obvious hero. And I'm trying to figure out if this show is going to make me hate it. Like, if they give me a reasonable alternative for Stringer, like he gets another really wonderful girl, and if we have to have Charlotte end up with Sydney, then okay, I guess. But part of it is that, and I was really hopeful because Andrew Davies had adapted, I don't know why I can't say that word, so many other Jane Austen books. Sanditon is only like 8 chapters, I think, is all she finished, which I haven't actually ever read. And I feel like the last couple of episodes is when he's been going off on his own. I haven't verified this, but that's just my gut feeling because it started out really strong. It started out very Austen-y, but still like very modern. You've got some incest, well, step-sibling incest kind of stuff going on. And the first Black character that she's written. So we've got Miss Lamb, who is from Antigua, and her mother was a slave. I guess her father was white. I don't know how that, I assume, in this world. But her mother was freed, and she is the heiress to her father's fortune. And so now she's this Black heiress in England and trying to get a rich husband, but not really. And there's all this really interesting stuff going on. And I do need to go back and read the original to see how much was in the original. Was the incest there? Can someone answer that for me? But yeah, the last couple episodes have been disappointing, and I'm not super psyched about the ending because Sydney is a jerk. And we'll see how it ends up. And in RWA news, our local chapter had our first meeting since the hashtag RWA shit show went down, which was only a month ago. And we obviously had a lot to talk about and a lot to think about. And as we go forward, one of the questions that I asked at the meeting was, what do we want? Like, what do we want to have happen? What would make you want to renew your RWA membership if you don't want to renew right now? What do they have to do? What are the actionable steps that they have to take to prove that this is an organization that we can continue to embrace and that we can work towards fixing? And nobody really has an answer. The officers from SIMRA were on the Smart Bitches podcast this week. Sarah Wendell is doing a whole series on this debacle, and she's interviewing various actors in it. And so SIMRA is the cultural, interracial, multicultural chapter. I'm a member of it. And the officers were responsible for creating the petition, the recall for Damon Swade, the former president. Sarah Wendell had them on to talk about the whole process and what they were going through, and it's really interesting to listen to. But she asked also, like, what do you want to see happen? And no one, including her, really could articulate, like, what they want. And I think that's a real problem. How can you achieve anything if you don't have, like, specific goals? Like, when someone comes to me and says, oh, I want a website, I'm like, okay, well, what do you want to have on it? What do you want it to do? Like, I need to know what to build. So you have to create goals that are measurable so that you know when you've achieved them. And, there's things like, okay, have a full audit, have a forensic audit, fire all the staff. Like, there are certain things. Are those the things? And does a plurality of the membership who are unhappy agree with them? Like, moving forward, if we're going to move forward, then people really have to get clear on what they're looking for. So that has been a concern. And it kind of links to the latest, as of today, the latest episode of Writing Excuses, which is a podcast that I listen to every week. It's a great podcast for writers. It focuses on sci-fi fantasy, but I think it's great for all writers. And so the last episode, they had Patrick Rothfuss on, who's the author of The Name of the Wind, which I haven't read because he hasn't finished the series, but I'm told it's excellent. And it's like a huge book. Everybody raves about it. So there was an interesting exchange between him, who was a guest on the podcast, and Mary Robinette Kowal, who is one of the hosts. She's also the president of SIFWA. She's also a multi-award-winning author. And I really find her on the podcast very insightful, and she's got great writing tips, and the way she thinks about things is really cool. There was this exchange between them, which I thought was both a good example of calling in, which is something I talked about before, where you check someone's behavior in a way that is hopefully geared towards making them change the behavior, as opposed to calling out, which is just shouting publicly how bad somebody is or what someone did that you find offensive. So they were talking about when a side character might take over from a main character in your book, and how do you deal with that? And Pat Rothfuss was saying, you kind of don't. And he made an analogy that your main character is like your wife of 10 years. And the side character might be like your crush in high school. Or later on, the analogy kind of shifted to, this woman you've been married to for 10 years versus a week you spent with a dark-eyed woman in Morocco. I believe those were the words. And so Mary Robinette was like, I agree with what you're saying, but could you do your analogy in a way that's not so sexist? And he was like, what did you find sexist about it? And throughout the course of the next few minutes of the conversation, you could see him really trying to understand her perspective and what she found sexist about his statement. And he offered a couple of amendments or ways to change it. And she was trying to explain. And by the end of it, I don't think that he ever really understood. And honestly, I did not understand either. I don't personally see how what he said was sexist. And so I think it's a really good example of just a really respectful, great conversation that was had. She called him out in a way that he was able to listen to, respond to. Genuinely, I felt questioning. It seemed like he took her feedback really well, but he didn't understand she asked him to do another analogy and he couldn't come up with one. And he comes back a little bit later and was like, what exactly was the problem with what I said? Was it that it was gendered? Was it that it was a relationship? And I just encourage you to listen to it. I will link to the time of the conversation in the show notes if you are interested. I just think Writing Excuses is a great podcast to listen to anyway, but I thought it was a great example of both calling in and also the difficulty that we have with people with just different perspectives and different ways of viewing the world are not going to be on the same page all the time. And that when we try to police everyone's speech, it's going to be difficult because by the end of, and it's only like a 20-minute podcast, but by the end of it, and I'm sure that they, after they stopped recording, they might have come to some consensus after that. But what I was able to listen to was just a great example of just, we're not all going to agree. And it just got me thinking about what happens next. If someone calls you out for something that they found problematic, and if they can't articulate it in a way that you understand, then there's no way that you are going to be able to meet their standards, right? I also appreciated that he kept pushing back on it, and he did it in a way that indicated to me that he was trying to see her perspective, and he was very open to it. He just didn't understand. Now, I didn't like the analogy, even though I didn't find it sexist. I didn't think it was a great analogy. I thought it was an interesting perspective, but it just felt like one of those things that men say that you're like, And men are different than women, and they have different perspectives, and they're going to give, a different take on it. And I think that we have to acknowledge that while we might have a response to it, does that make it sexist? Is there anything in that statement that was harmful to women? And at one point he was like, oh, was it the Morocco thing? Was it the racist thing? And I'm like, saying that you had an affair with a woman in Morocco, there's nothing inherently racist about that. There's nothing inherently sexist about that. I don't know. I don't belabor it, but I appreciated that she called him in, and I appreciated that he pushed back on it and asked for clarity. And at the end, there did not seem to be a resolution. And that's something that we have to sit with. And then what do we do with that? Do we then go out and say, oh, Pat Rothfuss is a sexist? Well, I don't think that's true. I mean, I don't know. It might be true. But in this instance, with this particular set of words that came out of his mouth, I didn't get it. But I liked the way that she approached it, and I liked the way that he responded. So that was kind of my point. The conversation is really important. And being able to have that conversation, I thought, was super valuable. And they talk on the recording about, well, should we cut this? And I'm glad that they left it in because I found it fascinating. So anyway, that was just my thoughts. So I hope that you have a wonderful week and that February is better than January for everyone. For episode show notes and to sign up for the Footnotes newsletter, go to myimaginaryfriendsshow.com. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you like jump cuts, watch the video episodes on YouTube. I would really love a rating and review to help support the show. My Imaginary Friends is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. For more fantastic podcasts, go to frolic.media/podcasts.